I'd like to introduce Molly Jacobs, who will be moderating our first panel today. Molly is a senior research associate at the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production at UMass Lowell. She has over 20 years of experience in public health research and practice to promote effective disease prevention solutions across a range of organizations. Since 2013, Molly has also managed the center's informed substitution and alternative assessment work. As co-lead of Cancer-Free Economies PFAS work group and an active member of the network, Molly has supported numerous initiatives to grow the base of scientists, health professionals, and cancer-focused leaders to engage in the environmental cancer crisis, developed training materials to support grassroots mobilization efforts, and provided environmental cancer epidemiological expertise to a range of projects. Without further ado, I will pass the baton to Molly. Please take it away.
Thank you, Leor. Thank you so much for your introduction, and welcome everyone. We've got a great audience and a really important discussion to continue having today, and I'm delighted to be with you. And as Leor mentioned, we heard from our presenters yesterday about the immense array of problems with current technologies and policies governing the disposal of PFAS, from detecting PFAS in the air surrounding communities near incinerators because of this technology's inability to completely destroy these compounds, to PFAS that's laden in the leachate coming from landfills. We also heard about policy options such as the current moratorium prohibiting the Department of Defense to destroy PFAS-laden firefighting foams until impacts and effectiveness of existing technologies are better understood, and to the need for equitable policy solutions that prohibit a U.S. waste management system from concentrating treatment and disposal in communities that didn't generate the waste in the first place. So if our current evidence is telling us that we do not have a safe and viable disposal method, what's next? What policy and technology solutions are on the horizon to advance safe and viable disposal methods for PFAS? So that's the focus of today's session. Today, we're going to, with the help of our three esteemed panelists, we're going to highlight programs and legislation that are focusing on the storage of PFAS waste until safer alternatives are identified, as well as future disposal technologies that are currently under development and what's needed to get these technologies to scale. And so although our eye is on the prize, we're really hoping that this stimulates kind of policy and technology solutions. We're also clearly holding that we need solutions now. We have impacted communities that need to have their issues addressed now. And so what do we do in the short term? What options do we also have on the horizon on the short term that can help remediate many of the impacts that communities are currently facing? And so with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. If I can ask our speakers to actually turn on your videos, we get to see them here, but let's get into the practice of turning on your videos. I'd like to introduce, first is Sonya Lunder. Sonya, we got to see her facilitate one of our sessions yesterday. She is the Senior Toxics Policy Advisor for the Sierra Club nationally, and supports the Sierra Club's federal and state policy campaigns to address the harmful and ongoing use of toxic chemicals. Sonya is going to help us go through some of the development and use of new destruction technologies that are being considered and implemented at some commercial scales for PFAS waste. Second, we will have Doug Hatler. Doug is the Chief Revenue Officer for what's called 374 Water. He's an environmental scientist and engineer who spent many years applying technologies to solve some of our most pressing global environmental problems. And Doug is going to feature his company's current technology, supercritical water oxidation, that's being used to neutralize PFAS waste for some applications. And last but not least, we have with us Daniel Rosenberg. And Daniel is a senior attorney and and director of the Federal Toxic Policy at the National Resources Defense Council. His primary focus is currently focused on the current implementation of TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. But today we're going to have Daniel is going to talk us through some of the national strategies at hand to promote new and safer technologies to end incineration and to take back or at least control PFAS waste going forward. And so with that, Sonya, if you, I don't see all of you. If you can turn on your video, if others can turn the perfect. And why don't we advance the slide and allow Sonya to get started. Thanks so much, Sonya.
Hey, thank you so much for that nice introduction. Yeah, I'll be speaking today a bit about enacting the technologies that can fully destroy PFAS chemicals, and it's an exciting topic. So next slide. As we heard Jonathan, Sherry, and Cheryl talk about the legal and regulatory tools that we've used to pause and halt incineration, Jane talked about the sector-wide work that's needed to stop adding PFAS to the environment. We have a really ad hoc strategy that we've been using in the advocacy community to both stop the worst practices for PFAS disposal, which are notable, to get governments and agencies to hold and contain safely PFAS waste, while new technologies are invested, developed, scaled. And we have this concept that all the waste that is changing places and moving around right now is often moving from a better organized, better represented community to a more marginalized community. So we are really going to take a pause and look at the ways that we can help influence the development of safer PFAS destruction technologies. And we've got some really exciting progress to share with you in that regard. So next slide. Really, when it comes down to it, I'm getting new news alerts and people sending me articles all the time about new promising ways to destroy PFAS. And I just run them through this very basic checklist that is time tested on the advocacy side with an equity frame of mind. We want things that will fully destroy PFAS chemicals to a very high level. Even these remaining concentrations of the parts per trillion level are very concerning in drinking water. Fish and aquatic creatures concentrate PFAS at incredible levels, much higher concentrations than the water they live in. The chemicals last forever. We want systems that won't concentrate or move waste to marginalized or scapegoat communities with a goal of treating waste on site wherever possible to avoid any kind of problems in the transport or this urge to send waste to places that have already been heavily impacted. We want contained systems. And that means that once the testing is complete, you can actually look at the residues and make sure that the process that was used was actually effective. And you can even rerun it in some cases to get down to those really high levels of efficiency and breakdown. And we want a requirement that the waste is tested for all kinds of hazardous byproducts before it's ultimately released back into the environment. So there's massive funding efforts by the Departments of Defense, by the EPA. We see a lot of academic research as well as for-profit businesses. We're technology agnostic. We want systems that are going to work well, but on the advocacy side, I don't have a horse in the game. I want things that meet this criteria. There was news this week about a new water treatment system that uses sulfite and iodine and UV light. Fine, on my end, if we can get people who are checking these boxes and providing that level of security to communities, then it works. There's going to be a lot of different technologies in terms of their scalability, their inputs, they're all going to serve a purpose, or many may serve a purpose when they can be validated and actually in place. We're not quite there yet. So the next slide is challenges. So the PFAS chemicals are incredibly unique, as you've heard through all those panels yesterday, that bond between the carbon and the fluorine is incredibly energy intensive. So the systems we're designing or seeing designed and being used have to use an incredible amount of heat, pressure, mechanical forces, UV to actually try to liberate that bond. Then once the fluorine becomes free, it's very reactive. So both there's a huge range of potential breakdown products that are formed and also can be reformed. So one, to also recap yesterday, one huge problem with heat-based treatments and incineration One is that they're not contained. So that waste is immediately out in the atmosphere, and there's no way of calling it back. If you had a malfunction, if your system wasn't running properly, those go undetected, and that waste is then perpetually out in the environment. There's also this risk of reformulation. So with many highly persistent chemicals that have been in incinerators, they're liberated, you break, the carbon bromine or carbon fluorine bond, and then as soon as they escape and the gases start to cool, there's a risk of reformation or forming a whole range of new and complex chemicals. And there's also not the tools even to be able to measure what's coming out of stacks in incinerators. And this includes thermal oxidizers, which are a more controlled heat-based form of breakdown. Pyrolysis and gasification are other members of this family of breakdown products. And we really lack the measurement technologies to look at non-target methods and see what kind of breakdown products are being formed, or total organic fluorine, to just figure out how much fluorine in any form is exiting the waste stack. And as I mentioned, once you have a failure, there's no recall, but so this is an intrinsic problem within incinerator type technologies. And let's see, so the way we gauge new technologies is both their effectiveness, breaking concentrations of, like, for example, the firefighting foam from a part per 100 concentration of PFAS down to low parts per trillion. We need to have a measure to look at the mass balance of fluorine and figure out where all that fluorine went. There are systems that add in calcium or other kinds of compounds to bind up the fluorine into an inorganic form or a non-reactive form. We want to make sure even contained systems don't have any leaking into the air, so that we know where all the fluorine is going. They will vary, as I mentioned, both in the speed and the volumes that they're able to handle. And this will be maybe a benefit for having cheaper, lower cost systems that can work maybe at a landfill versus something that's going to be addressing the massive stockpiles of military firefighting foam. And then we see a lot of really innovative ideas about using a treatment train, a process to concentrate PFAS waste, and or adding additives and binders that can catalyze breakdown or make sure that the final products are less toxic. There's also going to be a real range in energy intensity of these systems, and that's going to relate to the overall cost. So next slide, we'll move into a little bit more of a conversation about a little more specifics about the types of PFAS waste that people are gearing up to be able to contain and destroy. So next slide is a focus on AFFF firefighting foams. As I mentioned, they are parts per 100 or percent level of PFAS. There are a variety of chemicals in these new generation products. It's not just PFAS anymore. And as a result, we need good analytical tools to figure out what's in the starting product and then how much of that PFAS or organic fluorine type material is in the waste, and really accounting for that at a high level, because when you're breaking down millions of gallons of firefighting foam to destroy, even a small amount of failure adds up to a big burden in the environment. And as we've mentioned with incineration, millions of gallons have been incinerated already. We're concerned that that forms persistent greenhouse gases, unreacted PFAS, or any number of breakdown products. And the military and EPA have both voiced concerns with the types of unintended chemicals that are formed in the process. We know that incineration contracts have been relatively cheap relative to the amounts that some states have paid to solidify and landfill their PFAS waste, but we have seen states like Michigan choose to put the waste into a hazardous waste landfill rather than an incinerator, based on the idea that that would be a safer, more trackable way of getting rid of AFFF foam. And we understand this urgency of getting these firefighting foams out of places where they're being held and where they could be used accidentally or legally, and create a huge amount of pollution. We also see that at the state level, both Washington State and Colorado have committed to holding the unused firefighting foams that are in their fire stations, either paying fire stations to hold on site or looking into ways that the state could collect and hold this material until safer validated technologies are available. And both states are waiting for final guidance from the EPA, which is due in 2023. advocacy and congressional leadership has been able to put a pause on the Department of Defense incineration of PFAS due to these concerns about its impacts on the atmosphere, its impacts on local community, and really the lack of technologies to verify that incineration is actually destroying and completely destroying PFAS chemicals. But the military is also under a congressional timeline to stop using PFAS in firefighting completely. So there'll be another massive round of disposal questions to be asked about the firefighting foams that are held on every military base, every military ship, and every airport that is able to take military planes in the future, in the very near future. And then we have situations where municipal firefighting stations have either a lot or a little bit of PFAS foam. They may not have training in how to contain it and use it. So there's a real urgency to address the holdings of these foams all over the country and places where they could be used either in firefighting or in training that cause perpetual water contamination problems. And I live in a county where our volunteer firefighters training with just a small amount of PFAS contaminated the station well. And that contamination was probably there for decades before they thought to contain it. Shoot, that's my alarm. We're gonna slide through a couple last slides. So EPA has a disposal challenge that looked into 4 categories of PFAS destruction. You're going to hear a lot more about supercritical water oxidation, which EPA has done some testing and made some very encouraging statements about its potential to be used as a destruction technology and replacement for incineration. And just point out again that these are lots of different ways that people are innovating to try to use intense heat and pressure and mechanical forces to break down PFAS. To point out here that among these 4 categories, gasification and pyrolysis are really in the incineration family and have this critical failure in our eyes that there's no final validation and containment of the breakdown products and waste, and that those will just inherently be less safe for the community and for the atmosphere. Next slide. We're really also, as money is allocated for PFAS cleanup, and EPA just set some preliminary soil cleanup standards for 5 chemicals, there's going to be a lot of urgency to figure out what to do with these other types of waste in the remediation process. And so to point out that right now, landfilling is most common for solid materials, deep well injection for liquids, and incineration has actually been used for wastewater, for soils, as well as for concentrated foams. And there's really, the innovation we're seeing has the potential to really be game-changing when it comes to dealing with PFAS, but also other persistent chemicals that are highly concentrated, highly toxic, and that should be destroyed rather than contained. So, you know, when we say we're going to take the PFAS problem and we're going to use it to solve other toxic waste problem or toxic problems, I think waste and innovation related to waste destruction is another really a massive promising thing that we could be offering. Next slide is just to talk about how, you know, many of these systems are not in place now. Supercritical water, or SCWO, is something that is on a timeline to be developed and scaled and active, has promised to be able to work on site, as well as maybe in regional centers where concentrated waste can be shipped. But there is this time period where we've managed to raise questions and halt incineration practices in several places. And that this funding effort is going to be critical to get this and any other technology that's scalable up and running. There's massive opportunities with the military appropriations process, and there are companies out there that are very effectively advocating for this in Congress. So we really support the ongoing funding efforts, trials to prove that these technologies can work, as well as you know, the carrot and the stick. The stick is real restrictions on PFAS incineration until there's much better control and technology. We can skip the next slide, and I'll finish with a slide that says biosolids. So just to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of this conversation is dealing with the industrial side of the waste questions, and that biosolids are going to be a huge treatment and destruction opportunity as well as a huge challenge. This is all the waste that enters through the human waste system and wastewater system. There are PFAS chemicals measured in all of the biosolids, basically, where we've looked. There are urgent opportunities to reduce the amount of PFAS in biosolids by regulating wastewater discharge from hotspot industries, which is something Jane talked about. At the same time, just the sheer quantity of biosolids that produce is kind of mind-boggling when we think about technologies that could be scaled up and used to treat this massive and kind of ever-produced type of human waste and industrial waste. Certainly, testing is urgently needed, controls to keep these highly contaminated materials off of the food supply, and an acknowledgement that even if we were able to get PFAS treated and out of the wastewater system, there are a lot of other persistent chemicals that make their way through the wastewater treatment process and therefore are found in biosolids materials. This graphic is for a report that Sierra Club and Ecology Center did together based on information from our members and activists that actually biosolids are made into home fertilizers. So we tested home fertilizers as a way to try to demonstrate the problem and also help people understand that unintentionally they may be the recipients of these toxic chemical-laden wastes. And then biosolids, incineration would pose the same energy and cost requirements as well as efficacy concerns. So we should have a whole separate symposium on the biosolids issue, but remembering that that there are many benefits to treating PFAS, and systems we designed to address PFAS would either work for other contamination in the materials that we're treating, like a used water filter or biosolids, or be able to be used as a replacement for incineration and landfilling for other types of similarly persistent and stable compounds. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, and I'll answer Q&A using the Q&A function. Thank you.
Yay, kudos. Thank you so much, Sonya. Really helpful to get us going, to get us started. With that, I'd like to bring up our next speaker. Doug, if you could turn on your video and get us going. So just a slight reminder for our presenters, our organizers have set us up for success here. We have plenty of time for your presentations and for some panel discussion and for Q&A. So feel free to talk slowly. And that will also help our colleague, Anna, who's helping to translate, make sure that those that are needing a Spanish translation can hear everything that we're hearing. So with that, Doug, let me turn it over to you. We're hearing so much about this supercritical water oxidation. So we're all eager to hear what this technology is all about.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. Can everyone hear me, and can you see the slides? Or the slide?
Yeah, both.
Good. So we're going to talk about supercritical water oxidation for PFAS elimination. I will caveat up front and say that the discussion of supercritical water oxidation, once we get through the basics, will focus on our particular lens, 374 Waters lens of SQO, but we will speak in general as we go too. So, the PFAS substances, we've talked about this over the last, yesterday and today, but, they're made up of very strong carbon bonds, concordant and fluorine bonds, some of the most durable bonds that organic chemistry can synthesize. They've got unique stability and surfactant nature. Thousands of different variations exist. They're ubiquitous due to the widespread usage and inadequate treatment and disposal practices. We've been talking a lot, my CEO, Kobe Nagar, and I have been talking a lot in the media too about not only do we need to address PFAS, but in general, we need to move our waste practices and waste management technologies out of the 20th and 19th century. There's a lot of innovative technology going on, and we really need to start moving away from incinerators and landfills and deep well injection and all those things that are just moving the atoms and molecules from one compartment of the environment to the other. So we've got to tackle that as well. But PFAS are mobile via air and water pathways. And then we're starting to see that high level exposure to some PFAS may lead to various health impacts, public health impacts, And we're also seeing, there's plenty of PFAS in the environment that, longer term, we're not quite sure what impact it will have. I sat through a study where they looked at particular fish, and they did see some impact. So there's a lot going on here with PFAS. And what I showed here are some of the challenges and how to address this, of course. What we're looking at, and this ties into an EPA work that's being done through the PFAS Innovation Treatment Team, but we're looking at these types of waste residual materials and trying to solve these challenges. You've got for drinking water and stormwater and dilute PFAS concentrations in the parts per billion and parts per million and parts per trillion range. Granular activated carbon and ion exchange resins are being deployed right now. They're very successful at removing the PFAS from the water, but now you have the spent granular activated carbon and ion exchange resins. Typically, granular activated carbon goes through a reactivation and regeneration process by the manufacturer. That is being called into question whether that's effective enough to completely destroy the PFAS molecules. And then the ion exchange resins, they're either, again, there's the regeneration there, but then you'll have the concentrate with the PFAS. So, what do? You put them in a landfill, you're going to generate PFAS leachate, you burn them in the incinerator, and we've talked about, and you've heard talks about what goes on with incineration. We've got PFAS-laden soils. Soils are a problem. There's work being done out there on soil washing in other areas. Biosolids and sludges, wastewater residuals and biosolids. And then we've got our AFFF and spent AFFF. I know New Hampshire, I think, has just passed legislation to do a buyback on AFFF. Well, what do we do with the AFFF? AFFF is meant to put out fires. So you can imagine the incineration community doesn't really want to have to burn something that was designed to put fires out. And then it's spent AFFF from either firefighting events or firefighter training, or from decontaminating or cleaning fire suppression systems. And then again, we have our leachate. And the idea that you can just keep pumping the concentrate back into the landfill and just keep recycling leachate, and as long as it doesn't leave the landfill, that doesn't make sense either at all. And again, the reason these are challenges, we've got extremely strong carbon fluoride bonds, high thermal resistance, high chemical stability, and some of the PFAS compounds have precursors which can be degraded in the environment, but then they get to a final terminal state where they cannot biodegrade. So these truly are forever chemicals. EPA pulled together an innovation treatment team to look at PFAS, and they have convened, and they were looking at how to remove, destroy, and test PFAS contaminated media. They were looking to develop a toolbox of reviewed solutions for destruction, try to identify promising emerging technologies that should be looked at and pursued for usage, to validate and verify that they'll work, and then to be able to advance the science of treatment and destruction. The 4 non-combustion technologies that they focused on, mechanical, chemical, supercritical water, electrochemical pyrolysis. They also looked at combustion, but we're going to talk about supercritical water. They did put together a presentation and presented it back in February 2021 of their initial results. The preliminary results they showed with these 5 can produce a 99.9 or 99% reduction in PFAS and higher. And again, we're going to talk specifically about supercritical water oxidation. There are additional considerations when they're looking at this, particularly some of the earlier technologies in terms of where they are in their maturity life cycle, commercialization life cycle. There is always concerns about byproducts. Some technologies break down the longer chain PFAS into smaller and aren't able to destroy the smaller. So there's a lot of different factors still at play here, but these technologies have been showing promise, and again, we're focused on supercritical water oxidation. We did testing with AFFF. We did a 30-time dilution of an AFFF solution that was 3% PFAS. You can see the PFOS was 190 parts per billion. After treatment, it was 8.6 parts per billion. The total PFAS was measured was 243,000, and the sum of the PFAS and the effluent was 9.62. So very, very significant reductions. Those reductions may not be below the proposed parts per trillion limits, but these were studies to not necessarily prove that you can meet the pending regulatory requirements. It was really look at the destruction efficiency and the overall viability of this technology. There is a case study print that was published in the Journal of Environmental Engineering. You can see the reference here, and there are results of other SCWO providers in there. You can look and see how they did. So let's talk about supercritical water oxidation. What is it? So supercritical water oxidation uses the unique properties of water above 705 degrees Fahrenheit and 3,210 psi. We all know liquid water, we know steam, and we know ice. But when you have water and it's heated above, you can also say 374 degrees Celsius or 221 bar, when you get up in this red zone, it's a very highly energized fluid. It's not a liquid, it's not a gas. Obviously, it's not ice. It's a highly energized fluid, and the polarity of water is reversed so that the organics become soluble and the inorganics are insoluble. When you add excess oxygen in there, when you have these organic compounds and other organic wastes, the oxygen drives a very highly energized exothermic reaction, and all the organics are mineralized to CO2, water. You will get nitrogen gas for the nitrogen compounds, and then the other inorganics will either be dissolved anions or cations, or they will form precipitates that fall out. We call those minerals. Depending on the stream that you're treating, those minerals could have value. But that's the idea. If you look at this from the way our technology is, you have your PFAS waste and you have your air. We use the heat coming out of the system after it's been heated up to preheat the PFAS waste in the air, and then we move it through a reactor above 374 degrees C and 221 bar. It's actually closer to about 500 degrees Celsius and about probably closer to 4,000 PSI in standard units. And that in a matter of seconds, that reaction occurs and you form the clean water, which is mixed with minerals. There's also a distilled water that's created from the gases coming off the condensate. You've got air with carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Then you have heat from the exothermic reaction, which we said we reuse some of that up front. And as we increase the scale of the unit, it could potentially be enough heat to recover and use for electricity. So this is a very rapid reaction. It mineralizes the PFAS compounds. In our work, we have not seen any transformation into lower molecular weight PFAS. We're breaking all the bonds, and we have not seen any formation of hydrofluoric acid, either in emissions or hydrofluoric acid forming in the effluent itself. Our system is feedstock agnostic, so it could be PFAS in biosolids or sludges. It could be a diluted AFFF. It could be granular activated carbon or ion exchange, foam fractionate, the different different types of things that are being used to treat groundwater that need to be further treated themselves. Scalable, decentralized treatment, and our focus also is recoverable resources. So we want to take the water, the minerals, and the energy that was in that waste and be able to reuse it. This is what we call a process flow diagram showing the SCWO unit. What you'll see, and I want to let it advance a little bit further. So what you'll see is air is coming in through a compressor. When the system is up at steady state, we have heated treated material coming out of the reactor. That heat is transferred to the incoming air. And then we also use the heat that is taken out of the treated effluent here in a cooler. We use that to treat the incoming waste. We preheat those materials and they're mixed in this mixing tea, and they're very rapidly pushed into the reactor. It's a very turbulent flow here. It moves very quickly. What makes our system a little bit unique from previous generations of supercritical water oxidation is because we move so quickly from below supercritical to the supercritical state, and we move this very quickly through, you don't see typical problems from the legacy SCWO systems of charring, clogging, and fouling that typically occur here. So this material is rapidly moved through the reactor. The gases move up through a separator. Where they're separated, they go to an expander. Any water vapor, oops, excuse me, I always do that. Any water vapor is knocked out as a condensate, which forms a distilled water, which can be recovered and reused. the vented gases go out, and any excess energy could potentially be converted to electricity, which first would be used to power any needs in the unit during startup and shutdown, but then also could be potentially net metered into the facility. And then you have your treated effluent and the inorganic minerals that come out at the end. To look at this in the real world, what you're going to see here is a 1 ton per day unit, which is roughly about 264 gallons per day. What they're doing there is taking biosolids in the bottom, and then they're adding party plastic or party plastic there just to demonstrate that the system can handle plastics and other, long chain complicated carbon molecules. They're adding some fats, oil, and grease. So if any of this material was PFAS laden, it would be all mixed in this, what we call feedstock. This pilot unit exists in Duke University, where the initial research was done on our technology. It was done under, initially started in about 2013 under a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation focused on reinventing the toilet. But as the years progressed, we developed this, there's the commercial scale system now. This is, like I said, a pilot system. That's the feedstock going in. That's what it looks like as it's being pumped into the reactor. What you'll see is a 20-foot cargo container. All the process equipment that you saw in that PFD is inside that blue box. But when you look at the PVC here, that is what, that's the treated effluent. That's what comes out. And you'll see here another camera angle where it'll show the water itself at a higher flow rate. So as I said, this particular unit, this is a pilot unit that we use. It's at Duke University. It's owned by Duke, and we do treatability studies with it through a sponsored research agreement with Duke University. It's not, we call it a pilot, but it is operating at a 1 ton per day scale. They've done hundreds of runs through it. It's run for many, many, many hours over the past 6 or 7 years, and it's shown consistent, reliable, proven results. We have treated wastes, sludges and biosolids that have been contaminated with PFAS, landfill leachate, spent ion exchange resin, and spent granular activated carbon for military bases. We've done the AFFF 30x dilution with that, and we've also done AFFF rinsates from a DOE site. It always, what happens is the PFAS molecules, as I said, get mixed with the air, and the waste goes into the reactor greater than 374 degrees Celsius and greater than 240 bar. And what comes out is water, CO2. The fluorine is either in solution as a fluoride ion, or it can form precipitates like calcium fluoride, and then you have heat. We tested a municipal sludge. This is the actual result. So if you look at it, the pollutant on the left, chemical oxygen demand, was about 156,000 parts per million. PFOS was 110,000 parts per trillion. PFOA was roughly about 6,200 parts per trillion. And then the effluent material, you'll see the COD was dramatically reduced. And we had 99.99 in PFOS and 99.95% reduction in PFOA. And then when you looked at the total PFAS compounds that we measured, we had a 99.95% elimination. Now, in this particular case, we were at very low parts per trillion levels, which are below some of the proposed regulatory limits. Then that has to do with the fact that the concentrations coming in were were a little bit lower. As you get to the parts per million and parts per billion ranges, you start to see a little bit higher concentration of effluents. For us, that just means that we'll be adjusting the residence time and how we operate to give the materials longer time in the reactor. Our focus on doing this too is in decentralized waste treatment. Not taking the waste and carting it, all the way across the country, so it goes to a centralized. We want to be able to put this. That's a 40-foot cargo container. We want to be able to put these at a given site. If it's a remediation site that may be operating for a couple of years, then maybe it's there for a couple of years. This could be put in industrial facilities. It could be put at landfill sites. It could also be put at a centralized wastewater treatment plant where they need to treat biosolids or wastewater residuals that might have PFAS in it. I should say too that it's not strictly a PFAS system. Its initial purpose was to be able to handle fecal matter in underdeveloped countries, and we're continuing to pursue that through our Global Access Program. But this can also replace anaerobic digestion at the right scale, and it can be basic wastewater residual and sludge treatment as well. but what we've really found is it's showing to be very effective to eliminate PFAS. We're going to be commercializing 3 different sizes over the next 3 years. We're currently producing a 6 ton per day, which is 1,600 gallon per day unit. Our first customer will be Orange County Sanitation District in Orange County, California. They're looking at it for residuals and sludge treatment, but they also want to see if how it stacks up against contaminants of emerging concern and any PFAS as well. So they're looking to see if this is a viable future technology that can address the sludge and solids issues, offsite hauling issues, as well as contaminants of emerging concern and forever chemicals like PFAS. We're going to then construct a 30 ton per day unit, which is about 800 gallons per 1,000 gallons per day. And then we'll move to a 200 wet ton per day unit, which is about 53 gallons per day. These systems, as I said, they're prefabricated, compact, and modular. And really what we're trying to do in the value proposition is we want to decentralize the treatment at the source, reduce offsite waste hauling and disposal, transform the waste to reusable water, energy, and minerals. And most importantly, particularly within the context of this particular symposium, we want to eliminate the organic pollutants and emerging contaminants, particularly PFAS and any other contaminants of emerging concern, including microplastics, the endocrine disruptors, and other types of organic chemicals that we might not even have detection methods for. This supercritical water oxidation is very effective at breaking those complex carbon and refractory compound bonds. Our next step is we're manufacturing the 6 ton commercial units. Our goal is to get those out in the field, to get this technology out working and demonstrated so we can start to solve the PFAS problem with technology that's actually destroying it, taking out of the environment, and then putting back clean water and other usable forms of energy and minerals. So we're working on a number of military and airport projects, looking at how can we help with the spent groundwater treatment systems that have, or the groundwater and stormwater treatment systems that will have spent GAC on ion exchange, as well as foam fractionates. Municipal, you've got contaminated wastewater residuals and biosolids, as well as landfill leachates. And then in the industry, you've got AFFF as people start converting over, stop using AFFF and start converting over fire suppression systems. We're going to have to get rid of AFFF. And then for the cleanup, as well as for any residuals, AFFF residuals from spill events, any rinsates, and then waste. There are still industrial wastes out there that contain PFAS that have to be addressed as well. And then we're going to be commencing our larger unit for the commercial 30 ton per day unit in the second half of 22. So we're very excited. We've worked with the EPA, we've worked with a number of other industrial organizations. We're working with the Department of Defense. We've worked with the Department of Energy a little bit, and the results continue to be very, very promising. So everyone's excited to get these commercial size units out there to fully demonstrate this, push it past any concern about, is the system ready and can it address the issues of byproducts and any residual waste? Because, we believe, and I think the EPA has done some good work to show that supercritical water oxidation is a viable emerging technology for PFAS destruction and elimination. Thank you.
Fantastic, Doug. Super interesting, and just it gives us all hope that some safer technologies are indeed on the horizon. Before I move to our final speaker, if for our participants, if you have questions, please type it into the Q&A box, not the chat. And we're holding questions into the end, so don't raise your hand. Just go ahead and type them into the Q&A, and we'll pick them up towards the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to turn our final presentation over to Daniel. Daniel.
Hi, thank you. Are my slides visible? I can't tell. There they are. All right. Okay. So, here they're loading. Look at that. Great. Okay. So, first of all, I just wanted to thank the Cancer Free Economy Network and CHEJ and Sierra Club for convening this symposium. I think it's really important, and there's been a lot of great speakers already. In particular, individual folks. I'm sure I don't know everybody who helped put this together, but Catherine and Lior and Sonya and Veronica and Summer and Brianna and Molly, thank all of you for sure, and everybody else who I didn't name. I really appreciate it. So my name is Daniel Rosenberg. I'm a senior attorney and director of federal toxics policy at NRDC in Washington, D.C. Sorry, NRDC is Natural Resources Defense Council. And I'm going to be talking about sort of the federal situation as it is right now, with a focus on EPA and Congress and a couple of important PFAS related issues, including some ideas for how to address, at least initially address the AFFF problem, the PFAS foam problem. Next slide. I have to go down to my next slide. Okay, so there was a few threads from the first day that jumped out at me and helped me organize this presentation. And you can see them on the screen there. That the current, we've heard over and over, except for maybe Doug's presentation just preceding this, that the current options for disposal of PFAS are unacceptable. Landfilling, incineration, etc. We need more research to develop methods of destroying PFAS, although maybe SQO is going to be the answer to our prayers. And we need more information on our exposure to PFAS and tools to identify it in the environment. Several people mentioned this yesterday. And also, we really need to turn off the tap on new PFAS. Figuring out what is being produced and where in the environment and who's being exposed, how they're exposed, those are all critical pieces of how ultimately we, I think, get the legislation enacted or the policies enacted, whether at the federal or state level or otherwise, to address this crisis. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about briefly a few things, what EPA, what they're currently doing and not doing on PFAS. This is in an overview way, not at all detailed. Some of the slides look detailed, but we're not going to get into those details too much. Congress and some of the different ways, potential ways of moving legislation through Congress, which is difficult. As I said earlier, a proposed federal solution for disposal of AFFF, and then a more general idea for how we move the government forward, federal government forward on action on PFAS. And just to say, as this slide says, focusing on EPA and Congress, obviously FDA has a major role. Other agencies, certainly DOD has come up a lot. Consumer CPSC, Consumer Product. Oh my God. Okay, you know who the CPSC is. Anyway, Consumer Product Safety Commission. Sorry about that. There's other agencies involved, but I'm really focusing on EPA and Congress. Next slide. Okay, so EPA is. I think a lot of people think of EPA as. Well, I doubt anybody on this presentation thinks of EPA as a savior, but reasonably so, people look to EPA to administer many of the federal environmental laws that have been enacted and to use those to protect human health and the environment, which is their mission, including addressing the PFAS crisis. I think we need to be realistic about what EPA will do, let alone what they can do. EPA really did play a role in creating the PFAS crisis. They approved a lot of the PFAS that are on the market now through the new chemicals review program under TSCA, and they're continuing to approve new PFAS under TSCA. They've done very little to address it over several years, and even now they are doing more. Certainly, they've announced some more plans, and they're taking some steps forward under the new administration. I would say they're currently performing below our hopes and expectations, and really they won't do very much beyond what they've proposed now without a lot more pressure, whether that's from Congress or the public or both. John discussed yesterday a host of existing laws that EPA could use theoretically to take action on PFAS. He talked about TSCA. He talked about RCRA. He talked about CERCLA. He talked about the Clean Air Act. And I can't remember. I think he mentioned also the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, and there's even Clean Water Act tools out there. So all of the those are most of the major environmental laws from the 1970s and 80s. And they all have levers that EPA could use to address different aspects of this sprawling PFAS crisis. Next slide. So the kind of the flip side of what John said or what's implicit in what he said, I think, is that they've done very little with those laws over the past, wherever you want to date the PFAS crisis from. I mean, obviously the PFAS have been around for a while, and DuPont and 3M were hiding the impacts, and people can read Rob Bilot's book and learn a lot about that. But wherever you want to say that EPA knew or should have known about the PFAS crisis, they've really done very little to address it over the year, despite having all these tools at their disposal. And so even now, there are things that they could be doing that they have not yet done and really need to be either pressured to do or told to do by Congress. Some of those, and again, not reading all of these, but just imposing a ban on or moratorium on the approval of any new PFAS, that would be one step toward turning off the tap, which Linda talked about yesterday. Adopting restrictions on new uses of any existing PFAS, that sort of starts to merge into Toxic Substances Control Act arcana. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but and then just closing other loopholes. Actually, John talked about this one yesterday, revising the outdated consent decrees for PFAS that were allowed when the new PFAS were approved. There's a lot of different ways, and those ones are just under TSCA. There's other things that could be done to really move forward more quickly and more completely, and really, in many instances, on a class basis, meaning not the middle class and the working class, but the PFAS class, addressing PFAS chemicals as a class, maybe allowing more time or slower phase outs for essential uses of PFAS where there aren't already safe, viable substitutes. But in general, EPA could and should be moving much more quickly and broadly to address this crisis than they have. Next slide. Okay, and so having said that, I am not saying that EPA has done nothing on PFAS, or even that the new administration has done nothing on PFAS. That is not the case. They have taken some steps, some of which, each of which is important in their own way, none of which for sure is enough to really address the problem, and certainly not broadly. A lot of them are focused on PFOA and PFOS, or those two and a few others, but not across the board. So, this list, which some of you may be looking at, includes some of the things that EPA has done, particularly a lot of them under the new administration, or maybe, under the new administration. And we're going to talk about a couple of these in more detail, or at least one of them in the next few slides. But so they've done some. They've sort of renewed their scientific, reinvigorated their scientific assessment of PFAS, the Office of Research and Development doing more legitimate toxicity assessments of several PFAS. The Drinking Water Office has adopted some monitoring requirements for PFAS in drinking water that are going to kick in over time and are going to produce a lot of information over the next few years about what PFAS is in drinking water. And also the TSCA reporting rule, which I'm going to talk about next. So next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that is underway now, and this was proposed early in the Biden administration, is a reporting rule under TSCA. It's the TSCA 8A7 rule for people who want to be really in the know. But basically, the Toxic Substances Control Act has a provision that allows EPA, that gives EPA the authority to collect information from chemical manufacturers and processors. And it's a little used but important, and criminally underused but important provision of the law. and it gives EPA the authority to obtain information about, so just taking PFAS as an example, the class of PFAS, they can obtain information about what PFAS are being manufactured, where they're being manufactured, how they're being used, how they're being disposed of, how much people are being exposed, and how, so those things and other things like that. So a lot of information that's out there that we don't have. So we as EPA, we as the states, we as all of us, the communities who, the chemical companies, the chemical manufacturers, the PFAS manufacturers are sitting on a ton of information that they have not voluntarily disclosed to EPA or anybody else. And EPA has the authority and has always had the authority, at least since 1976, to pull that information out of these companies. They've never done it until now they're about to, and that's because a couple of years ago, people talked yesterday a lot about the National Defense Authorization Act, which I will also talk about. Using that piece of legislation, Congress directed EPA to use this TSCA authority to obtain information about PFAS. And so what EPA did early in the Biden administration is proposed that rule. They issued a proposal for notice and public comment on gathering that information about PFAS. They're required to finalize the rule by January 1st, 2023 or so. December 31st, 2022. So by the end of this year, they are expected, I believe they're on track to finalize their rule. And then subsequent to that, in about a year, I believe, companies will start reporting this information to EPA, and EPA should then be making that available to the public and states and other, et cetera. That reporting rule is going to be very important because it's going to fill a lot of the data gaps and fill in a lot of the black boxes that we all currently are dealing with in trying to address this problem. And we will have a lot more information about where PFAS are, how they're being used, how people are being exposed, where they're being disposed. It's going to provide a lot of information that should form the basis then for regulatory action by EPA or other federal agencies, more action by states, actions by Congress. It should be kickstart a lot of activity to address the crisis. Next slide, please. Okay, so but there's also overall the proposed rule is good. There are a few problems, and the biggest one I think is that in the TSCA reporting rule as proposed, EPA is using what it calls a working definition of PFAS that is narrower, much narrower than the consensus definition of PFAS. So just to summarize it in 2 bullets on a PowerPoint, the consensus definition of PFAS is a chemical substance containing 1 fully fluorinated carbon atom. And EPA's working definition of PFAS is a chemical substance with 2 adjacent fluorinated carbon atoms, one of which is fully fluorinated. So just the distinction between those 2 definitions of what is a PFAS is very critical for many things, including the scope of this reporting rule, which, as I just said, is going to be the basis for a lot of whatever may potentially happen regulation-wise in the years ahead. So EPA is using this narrow definition, which excludes hundreds of PFAS for sure, possibly thousands. And that includes PFAS that we already know have been found in drinking water and PFAS that they don't consider PFAS but are being incinerated all over the country. The EPA's working definition of PFAS is not only being used in this reporting rule, it's also being used, for example, in TSCA's new chemical program when they are reviewing new chemicals as they do under TSCA to determine whether they can come onto the market or whether they come onto market with certain kinds of restrictions. There are some PFAS that are going through and being approved by EPA and not even being flagged as PFAS in their consideration because they don't meet EPA's narrow working definition. This definition is also being used in the Drinking Water Office and other parts of EPA, so it's a serious concern. And just to flag that during the notice and comment period about this rulemaking, many people weighed in and told EPA, your definition makes no sense, it's too narrow, you haven't justified it, and I already said it doesn't make sense, and you should change your definition in this final rule. That includes 3 water utility trade associations who wrote in, 3 trade associations for state environmental agencies, the clean water agencies, state clean water agencies, state drinking water agencies, and ECOS, the Environmental Council of the States. 17 attorneys general wrote in and raised this. A number of PFAS scientists wrote in. So this is a real problem that is generally recognized. And I think Linda alluded to this a little bit yesterday, maybe in her talk, about the kind of dispute over what is a PFAS, and industry, coming up with all these cockamamie excuses for why this or that should not be included in the definition of PFAS, none of which hold up to scrutiny, but can still be convincing to regulators who are inclined to listen to the chemical industry or members of Congress. Next slide.
And Daniel, if you don't mind, just so we have enough time for panel discussion and Q&A from the audience, because there's a lot of questions, if you could wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Sure, I can do that. So the other issue that EPA is not addressing that's very important that people should know about is that they are only currently able to identify 29 PFAS in drinking water, and they, again, have the authority to get information from chemical manufacturers on how to develop test methods to identify PFAS in the environment, and they haven't done so. And so these are the reference standards that are talked about on the slide, and there's a need for legislation to force EPA to do that as well. Next slide. Okay, so Congress, we've talked about this a little bit. There are different methods for moving bills through Congress. You can move a bill normally, like we learned about in Schoolhouse Rock, through the House and the Senate, and then that goes to the president's desk. You can also move, the more common way of getting things to the president's desk now is getting provisions attached to what are called must-pass bills, things that are going to get passed for political reasons no matter what, do or die. And the main one that's come up a lot is the National Defense Authorization Act. That bill is enacted every year, come hell or high water. And so that has been the vehicle for much of the legislation on PFAS in the past several years and will continue to be. Next slide. Okay, so disposal of, so that gets us to the issue of disposal of firefighting foam containing PFAS. We've already discussed that incineration doesn't work, landfilling doesn't work, underground injection doesn't work. And so at least the temporary solution until supercritical water oxidation is completely scaled up or some other method is found to destroy, not just dispose of PFAS, but destroy the carbon-fluorine bond and therefore destroy PFAS, is to ban the disposal of PFAS through any of these means, and I'm talking about foam here, and instead require mandatory take back and storage of firefighting foam until a safe method of destruction has been found. Next slide. And so legislation has been passed at the state level to do this, state by state, in a few states, including New York, California, and Colorado. The one that NRDC did was most involved in was SB 1044 in California, which does just that. It bans the use of firefighting foam, phasing it out over a few years, and requires take back by foam manufacturers. Next slide. People can go through these later. I imagine they'll be available, but this kind of just has the timelines for the different phase outs and take backs for municipal fire departments, for fixed suppression systems like airports, and then next slide, for refineries and bulk oil refineries and bulk storage terminals. You can skip the next slide. You can skip the slide after that. And okay, so next slide. So all of that leads to the basics of what we believe is needed for a federal foam storage bill. So that would be a ban on the disposal of AFFF through any of the means we talked about, including export, a ban on the sale, distribution, or use of PFAS, phased out over time for different uses, the requirement of a take back of most AFFF, including from municipal firefighters, from DOD, from chemical and industrial users, and mandatory storage of that, storage with appropriate safeguards of that foam until a safe method of destruction is identified, and the foam and PFAS manufacturers would pay the costs for all of that activity. Next slide. The key drivers for moving federal legislation, whether it's through the NDAA or some other means, is through a few things that are already underway. The activity in the states has been very important, and it's making a difference in the states where it occurs. I'm not just talking about disposal, obviously, but drinking water limits and bans on uses and things like that. The market-based restrictions, meaning the market campaigns to get retailers to stop carrying products containing PFAS, or product manufacturers to stop using PFAS in their products, carpets, apparel, cookware, things like that. And then the pressure and demand from constituents. And that there are two sources that really build the base for that pressure. One is the data and information, some of which we just talked about, the information that will come from the PFAS reporting rule, from listing on the toxics release inventory, from test methods that identify PFAS in the environment, and then stories, which we heard a lot about yesterday, the experiences of communities living with PFAS, whether it's the disposal sites, the contaminated drinking water, whatever it is, those people speaking out forcefully and addressing their members of Congress is the way to move federal action. I know it sounds kind of simple and basic, but that is really the key. The congressional delegations that are the most active on PFAS are the ones where the problem has been identified most clearly from data and information that's been collected in those states, and then the people in those states organizing and pressing for change and to address the crisis. And that includes Michigan and New Hampshire and North Carolina, just to name a few. So I think the next slide is the last one. Yeah, so just to sum up, the priorities for action are disposal of PFAS and that needs to be done by, destruction of PFAS, and that needs to require storage until that can be done. Gathering information on PFAS, setting strong health standards for drinking water, soil cleanup, and clean air, bans and limits on use of PFAS as a class. And the way we're going to do that is just pressure from the local up to the federal level on our lawmakers and agencies to take the action that they should have been taking long ago. Thank you very much. I think my next slide is the thank you slide.
You nailed it. Thank you so much, Daniel. Why don't we bring up our full panel? Sonya, and Doug, if you can turn on your video, we'll get you all spotlighted. Our participants, we're interested in your questions, but also your comments. I'm really interested to hear your reactions to Daniel's last slide on priorities. We're going to move some of this into our breakout discussions, but just for quick reflections, write them down. We want to know what you're thinking about the priorities and your reflections on what Daniel and Sonya and Doug have offered as well. How this is going to work, we've got a number of questions that have come in from our audience. So I'm just going to spend maybe give you all 2 questions just to interact as a panel. And then we're going to move on to see what our participants have asked of all of you. So I guess my first question is this notion of a best disposal method. Kind of in EPA speak, we often think of the best available technology. Sonya, you had, we're, as one of your criteria, we're looking for technologies that can destroy PFAS. But then we see these, these efficacies of 99.9%. But when you're doing that in the parts per billion versus the parts per trillion to start with, what you're left with is a lot of residual PFAS. So help us reconcile what we mean by best method. Can any method, are we setting a bar too high to think we can destroy PFAS? Are we trying to get to a certain level? I don't know. Sonya, why don't I start with you?
Okay. I keep saying I'm agnostic because I think we're in this really fruitful stage where there's a lot of innovation and there's a lot of creativity. And, I think that this is the right time to just to put out that money and to put out that challenge. EPA had a design challenge. We haven't seen innovation in waste disposal like this in decades or ever, right? So we're making a problem visible that's been invisible for so long. And I think just because of the variety of types of waste that we're handling, the co-contaminants, the concentrations, and the variety of costs and energy inputs, I think this is a wonderful time of richness for innovation. And we don't, me personally, don't need to put my finger on the scale or lobby on behalf of any one of these. I see benefits, and I think that there's going to be some hiccups scaling up some of these systems, making sure that they really withstand years and decades of use, that they can be operated simply. So I'm really, I like all of it. I'm really excited that this all exists. And, I think it's just hard to overstate that when you talk to someone who's lived next to an incinerator for decades and you say, hey, like Cheryl who spoke, we'd like to ban the incineration of this class of compounds from your community. And we'd like to end hazardous waste and incineration. Like that's just not been a possibility. And, I don't want to sound like complete naive Pollyanna too, when I'm talking to people who've been at the receiving end for the nation's most hazardous waste for decades to say, come here, we're gonna use this problem to solve your problem. But I think we need to believe that. And I think we need to commit to that. And this kind of multi-stakeholder process and vision is going to be what frees up the money, sets the regulatory standards, and pushes the whole waste conversation in that direction. So I welcome all of it.
Wonderful. Daniel, I mean, from your presentation, it's completely clear that there is no current best disposal method, which is why we need these bans and moratoriums on any further disposal until we find that technology. But in your head, what does a best technology look like?
Well, I'm also agnostic to a degree, as Sonya said. I like that answer with a couple exceptions. I'm concerned, and I haven't been tracking it as much, where EPA is on possibly embracing pyrolysis and gasification as a means of destroying or disposing of PFAS, but that raises major red flags because right now the chemical industry and the plastics industry is pushing very hard to scale up pyrolysis and gasification as their solution to eliminating plastic waste. And that is just basically another form of incinerating plastic that is going to create all kinds of hazardous byproducts and is a terrible idea. And at the same time, they are pushing very hard to deregulate pyrolysis and gasification technologies and take them out of Clean Air Act protections. So, scaling these up, whether it's for plastic waste or PFAS waste, is the worst possible thing that could happen. So those should not be, I'm not that agnostic, but in general, I agree with Sonya that it is, that there may be other options. The one that I wish were available may not be, I don't know if people remember this, from The Cat in the Hat Comes Back, Voom. Do you remember Voom? It was used to clean up all the pink snow that was created by the cat ring in the bathtub, and little cat Z, took off his hat and there was Voom. And then after that, everything was clean again. So if we can come up with Voom, that's the one that I would most support.
All right, Doug. So for Daniel, Voom is his standard of what a best technology looks like. But how, as an innovator, as an engineer, as someone who's focused on kind of technology development, what standard are you designing to? Like what is best in the head of a technology developer in this space around trying to, dispose of, destroy, and create a cleaner environment from this massive contamination that we have with PFAS right now?
There's a lot of ways to slice and dice that question. I mean, from a technology, we didn't build the system to be a PFAS destruction unit, but we found out through testing and through work with EPA and through the science and engineering and chemistry of understanding PFAS and how to do that, you can break down PFAS in supercritical water conditions with excess oxygen. what is best technology is really complicated because it's really a regulatory definition. I don't think it exists, and it's formed by regulatory agencies and it's part of public policy. So it's very difficult. What concerns me more than what's the best technology is right now is if we go back and start measuring all the other 125 or whatever priority pollutants at the parts per trillion level, we're gonna reopen every Superfund site, every Superfund case in the world. We're gonna see how polluted the world really is. So I think there is a little bit, and don't yell at me, audience and everyone, but there's a little bit of a hype cycle here. I've been through the PCB. I studied DDT back in college. We've gone through the MTBE. So we found another family of compounds that's going to cause a problem. I think we have to react calmly and coolly. Most environmental regulation, I studied this in grad school, was formed by usually one major incident. You had Love Canal, you had the Safe Drinking Water Act had to do with New Orleans. You can go back to one or two specific things. I think, what we need to do on PFAS, we're going to need, and just like saying we don't need fossil fuel anymore, it has to be a phase out. We need a portfolio of technologies that work for the various applications out there. And I would say for the environmental exposures or the human health exposures where have the highest level of risk right now. So obviously, drinking water, we've got to address the drinking water contamination. Now, if the drinking water contamination leads to creating spent ion exchange and GAC, and it turns out that you can treat that with supercritical water oxidation, well, maybe it makes sense to team those together and we put those out and see how they're going to do on these drinking water and remediation sites. If you're out and you're doing wastewater treatment plants, and we find out that thermal hydrolysis process or some other sludge treatment process is more effective because you can get, from a cost benefit analysis, then that might be the best for application. But I think we have to look at the risk. We have to look at the applications out there and apply. And we need a portfolio. We need a variety of different technologies. Supercritical water oxidation works really well with a certain band of wastes. Outside of that, we're going to need other things. Incineration still has its place, but incineration, and going to the comment you made about, Daniel, the comment you made about, what was the technology you just mentioned? Those are still dirty tech. Those are still dirty tech. So I think what we need to be talking about is clean tech, green tech, get away from creating more, so we're doing a lot of these technologies now, particularly in sludge, where we're getting biogas. Great, we're getting biogas. What is it? Methane. So, all those methane pipes, you're just creating more methane. We need to look at these other technologies as well, but there is no best. I'm going to leave that to the regulators and the policymakers. Unfortunately, we have the industry lobbyists that are looking at it more from an economic standpoint than a public health standpoint. I wish that would end, but that's just part of our democratic system and the way things happen within our way of doing it. But the answer is there is no best to anything. It's what's most appropriate for the solution. That's why if you look at the pharmaceutical, you look at any of the effluent guidelines, it's different by industry and different by application. And I don't think that's going to change.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with the time we have left, I do want to turn to questions that have come in from our participants, and there's been a number. Doug, there's a number for you because everybody's, holding on to the hope that this technology might be our savior. And so
I have to go. I think my doorbell just rang.
Yeah, no, stick with us. So a couple questions about kind of like the methods of detection. I know we're getting into techno speak, everybody here, but when you test for PFAS in the technology to see what's left over or even what was in it, what are you using? There's all these questions that kind of can you just speak to that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the PFAS methodologies, but we're working with EPA. We're working with our customers. They are using, I guess, what I'll say are considered the acceptable practice methodologies right now. I think there's a 1603. I've left that to my technical team, but we are using what's considered the best practice analytical techniques right now that are available to monitor PFAS. And I know when we worked with the EPA, they were following the methodologies that they had been developing or that they're developing. And the same thing when we get into the PFAS and the air sampling, same thing. We're trying to use the best available, methods that are available right now. And I know some are still under development, but we are using what are considered, the best practice right now in the industry. Yeah.
So in your diagram, you showed it comes in, it kind of can be vented out as air or water. So when there's a couple questions about like, what's left behind. One question is, where is it partitioning to mostly? Is it going mostly to what's left behind? Is it going mostly to the water effluent or the air effluent? And what's left behind, can you characterize the types of PFAS that are left behind? People are kind of concerned that we might be dealing with some shorter chain PFAS that are left behind. So
Sure.
Where does it go and what's left? Now,
it's going to depend on each study, because each source of PFAS you get has a different fingerprint of the different short chain and long chain or whatever is in there. But in some of the experiments that were done in the detected effluent, we've seen PFOS, PFHXS, the C8, C6, and C4. We've seen some of those. PFOS has been in the highest. And again, like we talked about with, like we just talked about, depending on the detection methodologies, and depending on what was in there and what we started with will determine the concentrations. We're still seeing, again, that 99.99%. The one thing about SCO, and I mentioned this earlier, is it is a kinetic process. So if we can increase the length of the reactor or the holding time, that will will grant more effectiveness against those longer chain. But the one thing that the research has shown through the work that Mark DeSuze has done with ESTCP, as well as what he's done with 374, has shown that we're not breaking down long chain into small chain. What we're having is we're just having not 100% conversion or transformation. And that's hard in the field scale unit. We've done some bench scale unit with SCO, and we've been able to do close to 100% fluorine balance, looking at the conversion from total organic fluoride to just inorganic fluoride. So we've seen it there. But under field conditions, you do see some of these other compounds. In the air, we've seen very, very low concentrations, not in every sample. We've seen complete non-detects. In some runs, we've seen some very low parts per billion limits. And again, it's varied based on what the materials were. We are going to be doing more complete testing over the next several weeks as we work through some air permitting processes on some of the projects that we're working on. We do have to go back, and they are looking at it. And as you said earlier, they're not quite sure what this technology is. It doesn't fall into a checkbox. So we're probably going to wind up doing a full battery of stack testing against a list of parameters that we get from the regulators, which may or may not include PFAS. And we're going to continue to learn more as we go.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. So one question, and then I'll wrap us up with just a final question to all of you. But to Sonya and to Daniel, there's a question that came in about sludge and kind of policies related to sludge. Is it not realistic for EPA to stop allowing? So how realistic is it to ask EPA to stop allowing sewage sludge to be used as soil amendments? I don't know, Daniel, if and Sonya, like, what are some of the current policy opportunities or restrictions or bans, especially around sludge and the use on agricultural fields? I mean, we saw, the horrific impacts of this in Maine and other places. What are our policy options there?
I think Sonya knows more about sludge than I do, so I'll defer to her.
Unfortunately, everything's either possible or impossible. We create incredible amounts of wastewater and biosolids from the wastewater every day. So it's daunting. About half of the solid material kind of gleaned out of the wastewater system every year is applied to the land as beneficial reuse. The idea is that there's nutrients in that sludge, but we know that it comes along with a lot of persistent chemicals, drugs, residues of drugs that people take, pesticides in our system, tons of different classes of compounds. So I think there are real questions about that variety of chemicals and what happens when they're put on the land, either taken up by plants or washing off of the land into the surface water and the groundwater and moving all over the place. Maine passed a law that will put all of the sludge it generates into a single landfill that's owned by the state and managed by the state. And that definitely comes along with a big cost in terms of trucking all the sludges forever in Maine to these landfills, monitoring these landfills, and trying to, reduce the amount that's spread. It's obviously concentrating all the problem in one place. So, I think it's hard to say what, if there's a one solution that has to happen for everything. I definitely push my energy into prevention and minimizing the amount of PFAS that enters that system, but do have to keep, on our mind, all the other compounds that are there and where there's just as inadequate conversation and control for pollution. So, the other question is who pays? And so right now, in all of these cases with drinking water and wastewater systems, the ratepayers are facing increased costs. So I think that we really have to answer that question in tandem with a conversation about accountability and the price tag that comes along with all of these cleanups and who should actually be paying that price.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. So with all of this, we have to end on a high note. We can't just, we're dealing with some incredible challenges and, thanks to some of, these policy solutions that are giving us pause to say, hey, let's wait until we have some better, healthier, more protective technologies for destruction and disposal ahead of us. But what gives you, all of you, hope? And if you had to look out in 5 years, where do you see us kind of where do you see the most success? Where do you see some of the successes around technology innovation, around investment, and also around organizing? Daniel, given that we haven't heard from you, let's start with you.
Sure.
Gives you hope, and where do you see us going in 5 years?
Okay, well, I'll accept the premise of your question that I have hope, and having accepted that premise, I will say, this is like so many. it's more intractable in some ways than some of the other environmental challenges, but really, we've been fighting toxics and fighting these fights for years. Not we, the people at the symposium and our forerunners from previous decades have been doing this work, and it is just part of an ongoing fight, really, that we become part of, and you get the sustenance from knowing that you're part of a movement to try and achieve both a cleaner, safer world and justice, right? And so that, you just have to believe in that fight, and the alternative is to give up, and that's you can't do that. I think in 5 years, a few things will likely have happened, I believe will have happened. I think the pressure on product manufacturers and retailers to stop carrying products containing PFAS, which has already had quite a few successes, will be even more successful. I think more states will have enacted their own strong drinking water standards or bans on uses or other things that are going to be a good problem, create good, very good trouble for the chemical industry and get them out of uses and restrict them. And then I actually do think that federally, as more information comes out from drinking water monitoring and reporting rule and things, once there's more people realize how contaminated their communities are with PFAS, that is going to create a groundswell that will also lead to bipartisan action at the federal level, which is hard to come by relative to those other venues, but it absolutely can happen. It's already happened somewhat, mostly through the NDAA, as we've talked about, but I think there will be a push to really address this. And then the one other thing, if I could have my way in 5 years, would be a massive culture shift so that the chemical industry was no longer believed by any policymaker in America. And as somebody mentioned in the question answer, a more protective approach to product development and protecting people's environmental health would take hold across the country.
Awesome. You're here on that. Sonya, in 30 seconds or less, what gives you hope and where do you see us in 5 years?
So to start, with a one sentence description of the problem, things are really broken. We have an incredible pollution problem and none of the existing water, waste, air, food, or packaging laws do anything quickly to address the problem. So, I really think that fixing PFAS will hopefully fix these structural problems in the ways that our laws are not quick enough, they're not powerful enough, and they don't knit together. Chemical can be hazardous chemical in air and just moved into the waterway, and this shifting that's happening from one media to another, and the fact that sacrifice zones are always bearing the brunt or the concentration of these harms. So I really hold hope that as we find our way forward, we put in place the mechanisms that will prevent the future problems of this magnitude from developing for decades before they come to our attention.
Thank you, Sonia. All right, last word, Doug.
I have hope in that, similar to what Daniel said, and I think expanding on, I have hope we've solved these types of quality issues before. We have regulatory frameworks that should be able, that could be adapted and evolved and if applied properly, can work. So I have hope that we'll solve this. It's going to be it's going to be a 5 or 10 year ramp up cycle to get things really moving. Maybe not that long, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get. But we solved DDT, we solved PCBs for the most part. I think we'll do this with PFAS. Yeah. To Daniel's point, I have hope that we'll start really thinking more about how we're building chemistry. Yeah. Green chemistry is really, really important. What I'm more concerned about, so I think we'll solve this, however, as best it can be solved. I'm more concerned about water quality, water quantity. We don't seem to be, and that's a whole other topic, probably a whole other symposium, because we don't seem to be stopping draining our rivers and lakes and reservoirs. So if we continue to drain them down, then we're going to be getting higher concentrations of pollutants, lower sources of that. So I'm less hopeful that we're going to figure out quantity, because I don't think we have the mechanisms in place to regulate the quantity the way that we have.
There's all sorts of trade-offs at play. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, all of you.